Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn c7 to c5. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn c5 takes d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Bishop f8 to c5. Bishop c1 to a3. Castle kingside. Bishop f1 to e2. Pawn b7 to b6. Queen d1 to d2. Bishop c8 to b7. Castle kingside. Pawn a7 to a6. Knight c3 to a4. Bishop c5 to a7. Pawn f4 to f5. Knight d7 to c5. Knight a4 takes c5. Pawn b6 takes c5. Knight d4 to b3. Pawn d5 to d4. Pawn f5 takes e6. Pawn f7 takes e6. Rook f1 takes f8, check. Queen d8 takes f8. Rook a1 to f1. Queen f8 to e8. Bishop e3 to f4. Bishop b7 to d5. Bishop e2 to f3. Queen e8 to d8. Queen d2 to f2. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f4 to g3. King g8 to h8. Pawn a2 to a3. Rook a8 to b8. Rook f1 to d1. Queen d8 to d7. Bishop f3 takes d5. Queen d7 takes d5. Queen f2 to f3. Queen d5 takes f3. Pawn g2 takes f3. Pawn a6 to a5. Pawn a3 to a4. Rook b8 to b6. Rook d1 to d2. Rook b6 to b4. King g1 to g2. Rook b4 takes a4. Pawn c2 to c3. Pawn d4 to d3. Rook d2 to d1. King h8 to g8. Knight b3 to d2. Knight c6 to a7. King g2 to f2. Knight a7 to c6. Pawn b2 to b3. Rook a4 to a3. King f2 to e3. Pawn a5 to a4. King e3 takes d3. Pawn a4 takes b3. Rook d1 to b1. Knight c6 to a5. Knight d2 to c4. Knight a5 takes c4. King d3 takes c4. King g8 to f7. Rook b1 takes b3. Rook a3 takes b3. King c4 takes b3. King f7 to g6. King b3 to c4. King g6 to f5. King c4 to b5. Pawn h7 to h5. Pawn h2 to h3. Pawn g7 to g5. Pawn c3 to c4. Bishop e7 to f8. King b5 to c6. Pawn g5 to g4. Pawn h3 takes g4, check. Pawn h5 takes g4. Pawn f3 takes g4, check. King f5 takes g4. Bishop g3 to f2. Bishop f8 to g7. Bishop f2 takes c5. Bishop g7 takes e5. Bishop c5 to d6. Bishop e5 to c3. Pawn c4 to c5. King g4 to f5. King c6 to b6. Bishop c3 to b4. King b6 to b5. Bishop b4 takes c5. Bishop d6 takes c5. Pawn e6 to e5. King b5 to c4. King f5 to f4. King c4 to d3. Pawn e5 to e4, check. King d3 to d2. Pawn e4 to e3, check. King d2 to e2. King f4 to e5. Bishop c5 to f8. King e5 to f5. Bishop f8 to a3. King f5 to e5. Bishop a3 to b2, check. King e5 to f4. Bishop b2 to g7. King f4 to e4. Bishop g7 to f6. King e4 to d5. Bishop f6 to b2. King d5 to e4. Bishop b2 to g7. King e4 to d5. Bishop g7 to b2. King d5 to e4. Bishop b2 to g7. King e4 to d5. Bishop g7 to f6. King d5 to e4. Bishop f6 to b2. King e4 to f4. Bishop b2 to g7. King f4 to f5. Bishop g7 to d4. King f5 to e4. Bishop d4 to f6. King e4 to f5. Bishop f6 to d4. King f5 to e4. Bishop d4 to b6. King e4 to d5. Bishop b6 to d8. King d5 to e5. Bishop d8 to c7, check. King e5 to d5. Bishop c7 to d8. King d5 to e6. Bishop d8 to a5. King e6 to d6. Bishop a5 to c3. King d6 to d5. Bishop c3 to f6. King d5 to e4. Bishop f6 to g5. King e4 to d5. Bishop g5 to e7. King d5 to d4. Bishop e7 to h4. King d4 to e5. Bishop h4 to e7. King e5 to d4. Bishop e7 to h4. King d4 to e4. Bishop h4 to g5. King e4 to e5. Bishop g5 to d8. King e5 to e4. Bishop d8 to b6. King e4 to d5. Bishop b6 to c7. King d5 to e4. Bishop c7 to d6. King e4 to d4. Bishop d6 to b4. King d4 to c4. Bishop b4 to f8. King c4 to d4. Bishop f8 to d6. King d4 to d5. Bishop d6 to c7. King d5 to d4. Bishop c7 to f4. King d4 to d5. Bishop f4 to b8. King d5 to a6. Bishop b8 to c7. King e6 to d5. Bishop c7 to b8. King d5 to a6. Bishop b8 to c7. King e6 to d5. The game is a draw.